August 1945. The war was over. For the first time in its history, Japan had surrendered. Across the islands, silence replaced the roar of bombers. Cities that once glowed with pride now smoldered under gray skies. Tokyo was a skeleton of concrete and ash. Hiroshima, a wasteland of twisted steel and shadow. In the ruins, people searched for food, for water, for loved ones who would never return. The empire that once ruled half of Asia now struggled just to survive. 10 million were homeless. Famine stalked the streets every day. Mothers stood in long lines for a handful of rice. Children searched garbage dumps for anything to eat. The emperor, once a god in human form, spoke with a voice of sorrow. He told his people to endure, but faith alone could not feed the hungry. Then, from across the ocean, ships began to arrive. American ships, carrying soldiers not as conquerors but as occupiers under the command of one man, General Douglas MacArthur. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. It was not just the end of a war, it was the end of an era. When MacArthur stepped onto Japanese soil, he found not the enemy he had fought, but a nation broken beyond recognition, and yet, he saw something else, potential. He declared that Japan would not be punished forever. It would be rebuilt, reformed, reborn, but first, everything had to change. The Imperial Army and Navy were dismantled, the factories that built weapons were turned off, the secret police were dissolved. For the first time, Japan's people were free to speak without fear, but the transformation was not easy. Millions of soldiers returned home from the war, defeated, jobless, and haunted. Women who had lived in silence began to find their voice, and amid all the chaos, MacArthur ordered the writing of a new constitution, one that would forever change Japan's destiny. In 1947, that constitution came into effect. It began with a single line that shocked the world: "We, the Japanese people, desire peace for all time and renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation." Article 9. Japan would never again wage war. Its military was gone. Its emperor, Hirohito, was no longer divine. He was human, a symbol, not a ruler. For a nation built on honor and the sword, it was unthinkable, and yet, it was the first step toward rebirth. MacArthur walked through Tokyo's ruins and told his staff, "These people are the most disciplined, the most unified, and the most industrious I have ever seen. If we guide them right, they will astonish the world." He was right. The year was 1948. Japan had survived the unthinkable, but survival was not living. The ruins of war still covered every horizon. In Tokyo, families lived inside the shells of bombed-out buildings. In Hiroshima, the shadows of the dead were still burned into the stone. Disease, hunger, and despair ruled the streets, but beneath that misery, something powerful began to stir: determination. A quiet, stubborn will to rise again. Factories that once built tanks began producing bicycles, radios, and sewing machines. Men and women worked day and night, not out of pride, but out of sheer necessity. Japan had no oil, no steel, no colonies left to feed it. All it had was its people, and their endless capacity to endure. Under the occupation, American administrators brought food, medicine, and aid, but they also brought ideas, democracy, equality, and education. Schools were rebuilt. New textbooks told a story not of empire, but of humanity. Women, for the first time in Japanese history, gained the right to vote. In a land once ruled by the sword, the pen had become the new weapon. Still, there was pain. Thousands of war criminals were tried in Tokyo. Generals, ministers, and officers faced judgment for what they had done. Some were hanged, others were imprisoned for life. The Japanese people watched and wondered, how had it all gone so wrong? Yet while the past was being buried, the future was being born. A new generation, children who had never seen the war, grew up among the rubble, dreaming not of conquest, but of creation. Then, the world changed again. In 1950, war erupted on the Korean peninsula, North versus South, communism versus democracy. Once more, Asia was in flames for Japan. The timing was both tragic and miraculous. The United States needed a base close to Korea, a place to repair ships, build weapons, and move supplies. That place was Japan. Factories roared back to life. The shipyards of Yokohama, the steel mills of Kobe, the machine plants of Nagoya, all flooded. With American contracts, the Korean War boom became the spark that reignited Japan's economy. Within just 2 years, unemployment plummeted, production doubled. For the first time since the surrender, the smell of fresh industry filled the air. The Japanese were working again, not for an emperor but for their families, their future, and their survival. And yet, even in prosperity, the scars remained. The occupation forces still ruled. American soldiers filled the streets, their jeeps rumbling through cities still half in ruins. Some Japanese resented them, others depended on them, but MacArthur's plan was working slowly. The people who had once lived by the sword were learning to build a life without it. By 1951, Japan signed the San Francisco Peace Treaty, officially ending the occupation and restoring its sovereignty. The following year, the US and Japan signed a new alliance, one not of conquest, but of cooperation. The rising sun had been reborn under a new sky when the American flag was lowered for the last time in Tokyo. Many cried, both Americans and Japanese alike. For 6 years, they had been enemies turned partners. Now, Japan stood alone once more, free, but fragile. As the 1950s began, Japan faced a question larger than war or peace. Who are we now? If not warriors, then what? The answer would come, not from generals or emperors, but from ordinary people, from the workers in the factories, from the women in the markets, from the children in the classrooms. The spirit that once built an empire was awakening again, this time, to build a nation of peace. 10 years after the surrender, the rising sun rose over a different Japan. Gone were the ruins, the rubble, the silence of defeat. In their place stood cranes, factories, and the sound of hammers echoing through the cities. The same spirit that once built warships was now building the future. Across Tokyo, neon lights began to glow again, shops reopened, children laughed in the streets where once only shadows walked. Japan was changing, not through conquest, but through creation. The new Japan was powered not by armies, but by ambition. A nation with no resources was learning to turn ideas into gold. Men who once forged swords now built cameras, cars, and radios, and the world began to notice. Names like Toyota, Sony, Mitsubishi, and Panasonic started to appear on the global stage. At first, people saw them as copies, cheap imitations of American or European designs, but soon, those imitations became innovations. The Japanese had mastered something the world had forgotten: how to perfect, refine, and never stop improving. It wasn't just industry that changed, it was the spirit. The old code of the samurai, once about honor in death, became a new kind of discipline. Perfection in life, work became devotion, craft became art. Failure was not shame, it was a teacher. Every street, every factory, every school carried the same quiet message: Ganbat, do your best. By the late 1950s, Japan's economy was growing faster than any in the world. Factories produced televisions, bicycles, and cars by the millions. Ships left Yokohama carrying goods not for war, but for trade. The world that once feared Japan's armies now admired its workers. But this rebirth did not come easily. Behind every success were long nights, low wages, and endless effort. Families lived in tiny homes, saving every yen. Fathers worked 14-hour days. Mothers stretched every meal to feed their children. Yet no one complained, because they were rebuilding a dream. Tokyo became a symbol of what was possible. By 1958, the city was alive again, crowded streets, flashing lights, the hum of buses and trams. A generation born after the war looked around and saw a nation reborn, a Japan that believed in tomorrow, and with that belief came pride, a quiet, humble pride, the kind built not on power, but on purpose. Then, in 1960, a new milestone arrived. Japan signed a revised security treaty with the United States, marking a new chapter, partnership, not occupation. Protests filled the streets, not everyone agreed, but it was clear Japan was no longer under anyone's shadow. It was independent, confident, alive. The same year, Japan's economy surpassed that of Britain's war-ravaged industries. Economists around the world began to use a new phrase, the Japanese economic miracle. A miracle built not by luck, but by will. A miracle born from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In just 15 years, Japan had gone from ruins to rebirth. It had lost everything, and yet gained something greater. A new identity. A new purpose. A new kind of power, the power to rebuild, to innovate, to inspire. The world looked at Japan and saw the impossible made real. And the people of Japan looked at their reflection, no longer as conquerors, no longer as victims, but as survivors from the ashes of war. They had built peace from humiliation, they had created honor from destruction, they had built beauty. And as the 1960s dawned, Japan stood at the threshold of greatness once again, not as the empire of the rising sun, but as a nation of light, resilience, and rebirth.